What if your silence speaks louder than any words ever could? What if, in the stillness he expected to fill with your begging, he's now being haunted by the absence of your voice? There is a moment in every woman's life when she decides that words are no longer necessary. Not because she's weak, not because she doesn't know what to say, but because she finally understands that speaking into deaf ears only exhausts her soul. That's the moment when silence becomes a choice, not a punishment but a boundary. Perhaps you've been there, sitting across from someone who once made your heart race, now watching their indifference dull your light. Maybe you pleaded, explained, tried to make them understand what their distance, their sarcasm, their emotional negligence was doing to you, and maybe they smirked, or withdrew, or weaponized your words against you, until one day you stopped speaking, and he noticed. Not immediately. Men conditioned to take emotional labor for granted rarely notice at first, but silence, especially from a woman who once over-explained, over-apologized, over-compensated, silence begins to echo. In behavioral psychology, silence isn't the absence of behavior. It is a behavior, a response, a disruption. And Freud would say that what disturbs us most isn't what we hear, but what remains unspoken. Because silence is fertile ground for projections. When you stop reacting, the other is left to confront the only voice left in the room, their own. He thought you'd beg. Instead, you disappeared into the sanctuary of your own quiet resolve. And now, he's forced to hear what your silence is saying. About him, about you, about everything he pretended not to see. This is not about passive aggression. This is about power, not dominance over another, but the inner power to stop performing for love you never truly received. To stop auditioning for care that should have been freely given. To stop explaining your worth to someone who preferred confusion over clarity. Because a woman who chooses silence is no longer trying to win the argument, she's reclaiming the narrative. In this video, we'll explore what your silence awakens in him, how it unsettles, confronts, and destabilizes the control he thought he had. We'll look at the unconscious fears that emerge when you step out of the expected role. We'll examine how intentional silence shifts emotional power, invites reflection, and becomes not an escape, but a declaration. From the depths of the unconscious to the surface of our daily emotional lives, silence is not absence. It's presence, concentrated, uncompromising, and often liberating, and it begins with a pause. Let us now step into the psychological weight of that pause, where the unconscious begins to tremble. Silence, when intentional, is not passive. It is a message shaped in shadows, and in the world of Freud, shadows are never empty. They are the territory of everything repressed, avoided, unacknowledged. When you choose not to respond, not to explain, not to chase, you awaken something far more powerful than anger. You awaken the unconscious. He may not say it out loud, but your silence has started to unravel his psychological defenses. Because now, he can no longer control the script. Without your predictable reactions, he's left to imagine, to project, to interpret, and that is terrifying. Freud taught us that human beings are constantly managing inner conflicts between what they desire, what they fear, and what they are allowed to express. When a woman who once reacted, defended, or cried suddenly offers nothing but silence, she becomes a mirror to the other's unresolved fears. Your silence becomes a screen onto which he projects his guilt, shame, abandonment issues, or fantasies of power. He might start to wonder, did I go too far? Is she punishing me? Has she finally stopped loving me? Is she with someone else? Notice how none of these questions are about you. They are all about him. That's the first truth Freud would point to. When someone is disturbed by your silence, it's not your silence they're afraid of. It's their own inner voice finally getting louder, the voice they've avoided, the consequences they've postponed, the emptiness they've disguised as independence. We are conditioned from early childhood to seek reaction, cry, and someone comes, scream, and someone responds, argue, and someone engages. But what happens when no one answers back? The mind spirals inward. Your silence becomes a kind of exposure therapy for him. In the vacuum of your absence, his internal conflicts rise. If he was playing power games, now the opponent has stepped off the board. If he was emotionally withholding, now there's no one trying to decode him. If he needed your neediness to feel superior, now he's left alone with his own insignificance. I want you to see this clearly. Your silence is not an act of cruelty. It is a mirror. And not everyone is ready to see their reflection without filters. For some men, your silence is like abandonment, not because you left, but because they can no longer control your attention. Attention for them was the drug. Your frustration, your arguments, even your tears, these were forms of supply. Proof that they still mattered, that they could still stir you. But when you become quiet, not cold, not fake, not manipulative, just quiet, you cut the cord of reinforcement. In behavioral terms, you extinguish the pattern. The cause and effect loop collapses. And now, his nervous system scrambles for new input. Freud would say this moment touches something far older. The child left alone, unsure if mother will return. The infant who cries and hears nothing back. That early anxiety, buried deep in the unconscious, returns. Not because you intended to hurt, but because your absence exposed an old wound. And here's the truth many women resist admitting. Your silence has power not because it makes him suffer, but because it removes the distraction of you trying to fix what he never planned to heal. You are no longer explaining why his behavior hurts. You are no longer negotiating for the bare minimum. You are no longer auditioning for love. You are simply not available. And that emptiness where you used to be, your words, your comfort, your energy, becomes a void he must now face. Whether he learns from it or runs from it, that is not your burden to carry. Your silence doesn't guarantee transformation in him, but it does guarantee clarity in you. So I ask you, are you still speaking out of fear of being misunderstood? Or are you finally letting your silence say, I see everything, and I owe you nothing? As we move forward, we'll explore how this shift in silence begins to reshape the entire relationship dynamic, not only in how he sees you, but in how you begin to see yourself. Power in relationships is rarely about volume. It's not about who yells louder, who texts first, who loves more. It's about influence, who affects the other's emotional state more deeply, and who dictates the rhythm of connection and disconnection. When you withdraw your response, you are not disappearing, you are shifting the gravitational pull. You see, many women have been conditioned to believe that speaking up, fixing, or proving their love is the way to maintain connection. From early relationships, with parents, caretakers, or first loves, came the lesson, if I explain well enough, they'll care. If I try hard enough, they'll stay. Silence then feels like failure, like giving up. But what if it's not? What if silence is the very moment when you stop being the one who pleads and start being the one who chooses? To stop reacting is to disrupt a cycle. And cycles, as Freud pointed out, don't break by force. They break by withdrawal of reinforcement. The moment you stop playing the role he's used to, the emotional caretaker, the explainer, the forgiver, the entire structure begins to shift. And that shift, although invisible to the outside world, is seismic inside the relationship. He was expecting noise, a protest, a breakdown, a jealous reaction, a final text he could read to feel superior. Instead, he got distance. Clean, dignified, unbothered distance. Now, the spotlight turns, not toward you, but toward him. He is left in a room without the sound of your validation, without the predictable beat of your emotional availability. And it's there that the imbalance begins to wobble, because silence isn't absence. It's an interruption of the power he once held over your emotional world. Behaviorally, we are wired to seek equilibrium. When someone pulls away, the other moves forward to restore the balance. That's how control dynamics work. When you are always leaning in, chasing resolution, trying to understand, you are compensating for his emotional laziness or avoidance. But when you lean back, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation, the system is disrupted. Now he is the one left out of rhythm. This is not revenge. This is rebalancing. Freud would call this a withdrawal from the compulsion to repeat. The repetition compulsion, that unconscious drive to recreate past emotional patterns in an attempt to master them, is particularly active in women who learn to earn love through endurance. You stayed, you explained, you excused. And for what? Scraps of affection laced with control. When you no longer react, you no longer play your role in that repetition. And for the first time, you allow yourself to be outside the loop. And that's when real change begins. He may respond with confusion, or anger, or even try to provoke you again. Sarcasm, guilt-tripping, sudden kindness. But all of that is a desperate attempt to pull you back into the old dance, to re-engage the version of you that kept the story going. But silence, when it's chosen, not imposed by fear, not frozen by trauma, but chosen, becomes your quiet revolution. You are no longer speaking to be understood. You are no longer pleading to be seen. You are simply unavailable for manipulation. And that absence of response becomes presence in your own life. The emotional energy that once fueled his ego now fuels your recovery. So the question isn't, will he notice my silence? The question is, what are you noticing now that he no longer distracts you from yourself? Because power in its truest form isn't about control over the other. It's about autonomy, the right to no longer hand over your peace in exchange for crumbs of attention. In the next chapter, we'll explore silence not just as a break in dialogue, but as a form of communication in itself, the kind that doesn't scream to be heard, because it no longer needs permission to speak. There are words that fail us. There are moments when language becomes too small, too predictable, too easily twisted by someone who never intended to understand. That's when silence enters, not as an absence, but as an alternative vocabulary. And in the theater of human relationships, silence often says what words cannot. You didn't say, "This hurts me," but your silence did. You didn't say, "I won't tolerate this anymore," but your absence screamed it. You didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't explain. You simply stopped participating. That was the message. Silence, when used with awareness, becomes a boundary, not a wall of punishment, but a line drawn with dignity. It tells the other, "I am still here, but I will no longer contort myself to keep this dynamic alive." It is not cold. It is clear. In behavioral terms, silence functions as a form of response cost. When reinforcement is removed, the pattern loses strength. But unlike punishment, which often leads to resentment, silence invites reflection. It does not attack. It exposes. Some men, especially those who relied on your emotional overfunctioning, will accuse you of being dramatic or manipulative for going silent. But understand, what they call manipulation is often your first act of self-respect. What they call dramatic is often their discomfort with your refusal to keep carrying both your emotions and theirs. Silence communicates. It communicates that you're no longer available for chaos, that you've stopped mistaking conflict for passion. That peace now matters more than being right or being chosen. Let's take a moment to see it from his side, through Freud's lens. He's used to women who protest, cry, or demand closure. He knows how to navigate noise. He's been rewarded, perhaps his whole life, by women who confuse reaction with intimacy. But when you stop reacting, he loses the map. He becomes unsure, anxious, threatened, and this is where his own unconscious begins to betray him. In the silence, he must guess, what is she thinking? Why isn't she fighting me? And slowly he begins to project. He imagines emotions you never voiced. He assigns motives you never claimed. And in doing so, he begins to experience, for the first time, the very anxiety he once triggered in you. Your silence creates space, and in that space, things surface. If he still has access to his own emotional compass, he might begin to reflect. Not always, but sometimes. Silence, after all, offers him a mirror. Not every man will look into it, but some will. They'll notice the absence of your emotional labor, and they'll wonder how much they've taken for granted. But let's be honest, this isn't about him. The deeper function of your silence is not to change his behavior. It's to protect your own nervous system, to create room for your truth to rise without interference, to breathe without feeling like every inhale must be justified. In that silence, something happens inside you. You begin to hear your own voice again, not the one you used to tailor to his expectations, but the raw, unpolished one that knows when enough is enough, the one that doesn't need to justify boundaries, the one that doesn't confuse understanding someone with tolerating their harm. You start to feel a shift, from performance to presence, from reactivity to clarity. And here is where Freud steps in again, reminding us that repression isn't just about trauma, it's also about self-abandonment. Every time you silence your own needs to maintain harmony with someone else, you repress a part of yourself. But when you use silence as your truth, you stop repressing. You begin to express not through words, but through withdrawal. And withdrawal is not weakness, it is an answer. So instead of asking, why isn't he reaching out? Ask, what parts of myself have I finally started reaching toward now that I've stopped chasing him? Because silence doesn't just speak to him, it speaks to you. It tells you what you're no longer willing to carry, what you no longer believe you must fix, and what you finally understand, that your energy is sacred and not everyone deserves access to it. As we move forward, we'll look at what happens inside you when you stay in this silence long enough, not to manipulate anyone, but to meet yourself fully, to grow, to remember. When the external noise quiets, the internal voice grows louder, not the voice of fear or guilt, but the one that was buried under years of accommodation, the one that always knew, deep beneath your compromises, when something wasn't right. Silence is not just a strategy, it's a sanctuary. And when you no longer use your energy to manage someone else's emotions, an extraordinary shift happens. You begin to feel your own, fully, unapologetically. In those quiet hours when the urge to reach out comes and you resist, not because you're cold, but because you finally see the pattern. You're doing more than withholding. You're healing. You're telling your nervous system, we no longer chase chaos. We no longer argue for scraps. We no longer mistake discomfort for love. This is how emotional resilience is born, not through grand declarations, but through quiet refusals. You stop arguing with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop giving energy to situations that leave you depleted, and slowly, your sense of self returns. What often emerges first is grief. Yes, the silence brings grief. Grief for all the years you gave your voice to people who didn't listen. Grief for the emotional investments that brought no return. Grief for the girl you once were, the one who thought love was something you had to earn. Allow that grief to speak. Don't rush past it, because right on the other side of that grief is clarity. Clarity about what you truly need. Clarity about who you are when you're no longer reacting to someone else's neglect. Clarity about the kind of peace you never want to sacrifice again. Not for attention, not for apology, not even for the illusion of love. This silence becomes a form of emotional fasting, stripping away the excess, the noise, the artificial highs and lows of toxic connection. What remains is you, grounded, sober, awake. And from this place, the world looks different. You begin to notice what once escaped you, the way your body tightens around certain people, the way your breath shortens when you feel ignored, the way you used to betray yourself for temporary connection. And in that awareness, you begin to make different choices. Freud once said that maturity is the ability to defer gratification. Silence, in this sense, is a mature act. It's the refusal to soothe your anxiety with short-term validation. It's the decision to sit with discomfort until the craving passes. It's the realization that self-respect tastes better than any apology you had to beg for. You are no longer reactive. You are reflective. You pause before responding. You observe before assuming. You wait before engaging, not to manipulate, but to protect your peace. This is not isolation, this is restoration. And here's the truth most women discover in this phase. You never needed to be heard by him. You needed to finally hear yourself. Because in your own silence you find answers. In your own stillness you find strength. And in your own voice, the one you silenced for too long, you find home. So don't rush back into the noise. Stay here. Breathe here. Listen here. The woman you are becoming doesn't beg for breadcrumbs anymore. She bakes her own clarity. Now, as we enter the final chapter, we'll gather what's been revealed and ask one final question. Not for him, but for you. There comes a moment when you realize the silence you once feared has become your greatest teacher. What began as a reaction, perhaps to his distance, his disrespect, his inability to meet you where you are, has transformed into something deeper, a refuge, a form of self-possession, a quiet revolution in the way you live, love, and listen. You didn't lose your voice, you reclaimed it, by choosing when and where to speak. You didn't walk away from connection, you walked away from distortion, and you didn't fall silent to punish him. You fell silent to protect you. In a world that demands women explain, justify, and overextend, your silence is a radical act of emotional maturity. It says, I know my worth, even if you pretend not to see it. It says, I don't need to prove myself to someone who benefits from my confusion. It says, I'm no longer afraid to be alone because I've finally made peace with myself. Freud would nod at this point, because the path to individuation, to becoming a whole woman rather than a reflection of someone else's desire, begins with a rupture, a break in the pattern, a refusal to keep repeating the old story. Silence was your break, and through that rupture, something new has emerged. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence of strength, the kind that doesn't need to perform, the kind that doesn't need to chase, the kind that no longer fears being misunderstood, because it has stopped needing approval to exist. You are no longer reacting to his behavior. You are observing it. You are no longer craving his attention. You are choosing where your energy goes. You are no longer hoping for him to change. You are changing the way you engage. And this shift, subtle, internal, powerful, is not just personal. It's generational. Because every time a woman chooses self-respect over emotional chaos, she changes the script for those who come after her. So, let this be the chapter where you stop asking, will he miss me? And start asking, what part of myself have I finally stopped abandoning? Because healing is not always loud. Sometimes it's just a quiet refusal to return to what once broke you. Silence is also a response, and sometimes your greatest healing. And now I invite you to share your voice. In the comments, tell me, have you experienced the impact of silence in your relationships? How did it change the dynamic? And what did it reveal about you? If this reflection spoke to you, subscribe for more insights on emotional clarity, autonomy, and the psychology behind the patterns we break.